Guys, welcome back. We are getting into our next chapter of art history. We are still in technically the Middle Ages. Remember, the Middle Ages does not really technically end until the 1400s. So we are starting now the Middle Ages in Italy. We've looked at it in France, we've looked at it in Germany, we've looked at it in England and Spain. So the Middle Ages in Italy is also called the Precursors to the Renaissance. It's technically chapter 19 in your book. Make sure you take a look at the first page and a half of the note packet that I posted. All right, you probably want to print that out if you don't already have it. And I will be splitting this video into two parts. So we'll have part one, which is the intro to Precursors of the Renaissance, and then part two, which is going to be on the one piece that you have to know from this section. All right. So let's get into a quick do now that should hopefully jog your memory about some previous periods that we have looked at and how they're connected to this new period that we're looking at. Now, take a moment, look at the image, and then think about the answer to this question in your head. So, what artistic style that we have studied previously do you believe will have greatly influenced the Italian artists prior to the 1200s? How can you tell by looking at that piece, or at this piece, the Madonna enthroned? So hit pause, think about it for a minute, and then continue. All right. Hopefully, right off the bat, just by looking at some of these key features, you realize that this was greatly influenced by Byzantine art. Well, why? If you think back to when we looked at Byzantine art, the Byzantine Empire had controlled Italy for a period of 60 to 70 years. That greatly influenced the art and the artist that was created in that era. We have that gold background symbolizing the spirituality of the scene and the idea that the scene was taking place not in the earthly world, but in the heavenly world. We see the nimbus. We see Mary as the throne for which Christ sits on. Her body is not necessarily realistic. Her face is very almost like a round disc mimicking the nimbus above her head. We see the angels that are not very realistic. They're basically stylized. So all of those things are contributing to the fact that this was greatly influenced by the Byzantine artists that had come previously when Justinian, the Byzantine Empire, took over this area of the world. I want you to think, though, where's the one area that we see the artist here trying to play with some depth? So think about that. I'm not going to give you the answer yet. We'll talk about it when we get to it in our video. All right. So in your notebook, you want to write down that we are now in chapter 19, the Middle Ages in Italy, which essentially goes from the 1200s to the 1400s. We're really going to be focusing on the 1200s and 1300s today, and looking at a couple of artists that exhibit the qualities that are important to know for this era. So Italy around the early, or not the early Middle Ages, but Italy in the Middle Ages was broken up into a bunch of city-states. So each of these city-states is independent. They had their own form of government. They had their own leaders, some dictatorships, some of them military dictatorships, some of them democracies. But what you also have to know is that these city-states are all independently wealthy. They are wealthy because of trade along the Mediterranean, specifically with the Middle East as well as Northern Africa. The Papal States are where the modern-day city of Rome is. They were very powerful. It was the home of the Catholic Church. The Venetian city-state in the north was one of the most wealthy of all of the city-states because of its access to trade along the Adriatic Sea. And then the Duchy of Milan in the northern area of Italy was essentially a military powerhouse, and it had to be. And if you look at its location, think about, well, why would they have to be a military powerhouse? And the reason was they were on the border between the Kingdom of France and the Holy Roman Empire. And I haven't brought it up yet, but you're probably thinking, or maybe thinking about, what about the city-state of Florence? So the city-state of Florence was an intellectual center, and it's starting to be that in the Middle Ages, and it's going to continue to be that in the Renaissance. Florence was, for a lot of its history, essentially a democracy where they would elect various leaders. They looked at themselves as kind of the little guy against the much bigger city-states. They butted right up to the papal city-state. the Papal States. So, when you get the idea of David and Goliath, they thought that they were David and the Papal States were Goliath. And we're going to see how that comes into account when we look at the sculpture of the David by Michelangelo that's going to be created in the High Renaissance. So before we get into the art, we got to talk a little bit about the history. I gave you a lot of the tidbits to the history when I talked about over the last two slides, so you'll want to hit pause and write down what I haven't read. The one thing I didn't bring up is that, the Renaissance is first noticed in Italy. Remember, Renaissance means rebirth because, there's going to be these major artistic developments that are taking place because of artists being exposed to ideas coming in because of trade from the Middle East and from Africa. And remember, while Europe kind of almost forgets the texts of the philosophers and the mathematicians of Greece and Rome, those ideas are going to kind of still continue in the Islamic world. And because of the Crusades that will happen in the Middle Ages, Europeans are going to have contact with these places and bring those ideas back. But I don't want you to think that it just starts in Italy. The Northern Renaissance and the northern countries of Europe will also begin to experience this Renaissance as well simultaneously and also begin to innovate in various artistic techniques. We have the reintroduction of humanism, that man is the measure of all things and the interest in the natural world. The idea of individualism and the reward for heroic achievements, and artists are finally going to begin to put their name on their creations. They will be deemed, and they're going to want to be seen on almost a higher plane than just regular craftsmen like carpenters. They will be creating portraits of their patrons, and the patrons of this era will begin to branch out. They'll be merchants, rich merchants, not just the Catholic Church. And the Italian Renaissance is broken into three specific groups. There is the Precursor era, which is the 1200s and the 1300s. We have the early Renaissance, known as the Quattrocento, which is the 1400s. And then finally, the High Renaissance, which is the early 1500s. And the High Renaissance actually officially stops with the death of Raphael. And we'll talk more about that when we get to him. So above here are just some of the key artists that you will come to know. Some of them are in the AP Art History curriculum. Some of them are not. Especially for the Precursor era, Giotto is one that you're going to need to know. When we get to the early Renaissance, Botticelli, Alberti, Ghiberti, we'll talk about some of them. And then in the High Renaissance, you will have pieces for each of those gentlemen. So Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, and Titian. But these are kind of the key guys in the various parts of the Renaissance. So as we go through this chapter, the main goal that we're going to be thinking of is we are going to examine how the revival of classical values in particular play a role in the growth of humanism. So we're going to be looking at that as we go through the pieces and thinking about that idea. And we're going to start out by looking at a piece that is not in the 250, but is a piece that you all know because it was created during the Middle Ages in Italy. So it is part of a complex. It's a religious complex, and it's known as the Pisa Cathedral Complex. And what obviously is the piece that you guys know the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Now, the Leaning Tower of Pisa in the back there was a bell tower. All right. When we think of Gothic cathedrals, we normally think of the French version or the British version where the cathedral bells are in the front, all right, in the front facade or the westwork of the cathedral. In some Italian cathedrals in the Middle Ages, they were separate, okay, and they were towers. They were called campanales. And then that big round dome building that we have in the front is a building that was called a baptistery. And this baptistery is where baptisms took place. And if you look at the baptistery, and you also see it mimicked in the cathedral itself, we see some kind of convergence of Greek and Roman elements and also some Gothic elements. We see the Gothic tracery in the little areas in the second level, the second essentially register of the baptistery. But then we see the colonnade that goes around that very much mimics a Roman building or a Roman temple. And then we see kind of the small windows, and that's very Romanesque. If you look at the cathedral, we see the three entranceways. And again, that represents Father, Son, Holy Spirit, the Holy Trinity. And we saw that in Northern European cathedrals as well. So I just wanted to kind of show you a little bit of the difference in architecture in Italy during the Gothic era. see a little aerial view. You can still see essentially the shape of the cathedral is the same. That basilican plan with the two transepts to make a cross. We're going to skip this slide because we've kind of already talked about how the Byzantine characteristics are seen in this area. And we're going to talk about, though, how they're going to be slightly altered. So we already looked at this piece when we did our do now. We talked about all the reasons why it is Byzantine. But what I want you to think about, well, how did Cimabue alter this to make it look a little bit more realistic? So think about that for a minute. So if you think about why, hopefully you might pick up on, well, there's a lot of detail in the foldings of the drapery, which is true, okay? So a more heightened sense of realism in the drapery. But one of the other ways that he creates a sense of realism is the throne that Mary is sitting in has some three-dimensionality to it. So there's a sense of depth there. Now he has not perfected the idea of perspective. That won't happen until the High Renaissance. But he's playing with the idea that there's some recessional space there. Okay, so that's how we're playing with the Byzantine style, or we're altering the Byzantine style. His student, Giotto, is going to take this all one step further. And if you were to compare the two, there is definitely some Byzantine elements. And if we were to put the two together here, Mary's is more realistic anatomically. Now, she still has this kind of wide throne-like seat body that she has. But if you look at her face, more realistic. The angels look more realistic. The various saints standing around look more realistic. They look more like individuals. And there is even more experimentation with creating recessional space, more diagonals. She is sitting in this throne that almost looks like it is, you can actually see the depth of the two doors that are coming outwards. And those doors could close and they could open. And they are being used through a set of diagonals. So he's playing with this even more. And we're going to see in the one piece that is in the image set how he is going to take it one step further to show some innovation. And we're going to see that in the Arena Chapel. The Arena Chapel is the piece that we are going to look at in part 2 of the Precursors to the Renaissance, and it is one of the foundational pieces of art in all of Western European history. So stay tuned. We will get to this piece, the Arena Chapel, also known as the Scrovini Chapel.